Thank you so much. Vuyom Voko there joining us from Waterkloof Air Force Base. Here in studio, I am joined by Lebohang Pheko, who's joining us via virtual link, a senior research fellow and political economist at the Trade Collective. And in studio we had for advocate Sipho Mantula from the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs. Advocate Mantula, I'm going to start with you on this one. Just listening into the conversation that Zianda had a bit earlier on with Basil, February's brother. The thing that came to my mind is a question around how do we understand the role of the frontline states, but also bringing in the complexity in that, for instance, the role that Zimbabwe, after its liberation, would have played, which some people have seen to be anti what the frontline states were standing for.
No, correctly, Aldrin, but as you talk of frontline states, which is SADC now, we call him then the SADC community, Zambia, Tanzania, Zimbabwe have played a key role. But when you look at this role, it is, as my sister have said earlier, the SADC should have taken this project also, as early as 1992 or 1994, how to deal with the freedom fighters. And at the same time, you will understand that one of the key challenges on this issue is that you have governments who have undermined the role of all liberation movements. And these governments, having undermined them, it goes back to the issues that I've been trying to look at to say, beyond these policies, was it a delay deliberately to look at these questions because it is opening can of worms. It is the issue that is emotional. It is something that is spiritual. It is something that is linked to the loss of human dignity. And also I try to problematize it, that this exhumation is also done under apartheid law of 1980. So we have not moved also when you look at what has happened previously and how governments have struggled. But I think solidarity amongst the SADC member states and the liberation movements had to be broadened for the young generation of this present moment that we are in, because you will know the liberation movements always close rank. But I don't think when it comes to history, when it comes to memory, they want to close ranks. And it is very important to close ranks even when it comes to memory, when it comes to history and heritage. And the return of cultural artifacts also that have been stolen in many other countries. It is one of the other projects. But like I said to you, Aldrin, the challenge is that we have an exhumation law of 1980 that is used by the 1994 government, and we think everything will go smoothly. There will always be challenges. The issue of money has always been the bone of even contention when we have to deal with these issues of liberation movements. So it is important for us to look at that. Yes, Robert Mugabe, the late Robert Mugabe, has played his role. Samora Machel has played his role. Julius Nyerere has played his role. But when you look at the liberation movements that we talk of, Makoti today, a founding member of the PAC, John Nyati-Pokela, these were the members who fought for this country both at the UN level, at the OAU level, but they were never recognized.
But with Robert Mugabe, isn't that... Because the complexity with the Robert Mugabe issue is that you have a Joshua Nkomo who was seen to be more open to the idea of working with liberation movements from South Africa. This is now after liberation was gained in Zimbabwe. But there seemed to have been, as some may argue, a pushback from Robert Mugabe at the time. And I don't know where the distortion comes in, but the argument was that Robert Mugabe wasn't keen on the MK setting up camp in Zimbabwe.
No, correct. I wanted even Mbeki to can verify that, because the PAC was more acceptable in Zimbabwe.
Actually, yes.
Even for now, to bring John Nyati-Pokela, Minister Gayton Mackenzie will not have been the person who will have received those mortal. They had to bring the PAC leadership to go and receive that, because Zimbabwe was not even comfortable with this GNU arrangement of ministers of GNU to be the one carrying this process. So as you are saying, the ZANU-PF and the ZANU moments, can be brought into this issue. One will say it is the same like what you see in Mozambique, but Mozambique is quite different. Angola is quite different. UNITA, MPLA, quite different, because the apartheid government also had its own ways of working with some of the liberation movements. Hence you find that most of the hanged freedom fighters are from the PAC. As it was said earlier, those who are in jail And those who were mostly hanged, the Vulindlela brothers, who were hanged, they were from the PAC. The youngest prisoner was from the PAC, the then Deputy Chief Justice, Dikhamu Seneke. He went to jail at the age of 14. But you hardly find that, and that's where the selective of narrative and memory is being held by many academics, many scholars, and media institutions also drive that narrative. But maybe Mbeki can try to...
And let's bring her in. Mbeki, your take on the role of course, the frontline states, but also the contested version of history when it comes to how Zimbabwe, or the role that Zimbabwe would have played for the liberation of South Africa. And this is now speaking about the Zimbabwe post-1980.
No, I'm in agreement with much of what has been said, particularly around the contestation, Aldrin and the viewers. The contestations also arise from this idea of the, there was this construct called the authentic movement, and those were the ones which were really ordained respectfully by Western powers at the time. So that would have been the ANC. That would have been ZAPU, that would have been SWAPO, that would have been Frelimo. And so this idea of the authentics versus the inauthentics, or versus the ones that were a bit viewed as more radical or more revolutionary. So it would have been SWAPO, instead SWANU, PAC, and so forth, who were viewed as not as authentic by some particular Western narratives. And I think that the anti-apartheid movement globally, particularly in Europe and the US, there were different strains of it, also played into that, particularly around as the acceleration towards a negotiated settlement began to gather momentum in the 1970s and the 1980s, and then moving into the late 1980s in particular. I think another piece of that is indeed that in Zimbabwe, there was a view that certain the PAC, especially by both Ndade Nkomo and Ndade Mugabe, were viewed as more aligned to ZANU now. In fact, ZANU then, it's a bit different to the ZANU of today, I must say. This is what power does to the best of liberation movements. But I think that there was an ideological proximity, but there was also a much deeper understanding and a deeper ideological proximity also in terms of the land question. And this is where I think the ANC and the so-called authentics were viewed as more palatable. So your SWAPUs, your ANCs, and etc. Because on the land question, one of the things that set the inauthentics or the more radical Africanist and Black conscious parties apart was their common thread that land was an inevitable settlement of any liberation project, not just civil rights, anti-racism, and it wasn't a rainbow nation. That certainly was not it at all. Also to add that the importance of these other movements in this narrative, as has already been said, is incredibly important. I want to note for us, Aldrin and the viewers and Comrade Mantula, that the passing of Ndade Edwin Makoti, who is one of the few PAC members who is being repatriated today, was reported in the New York Times at the time. And this is no small feat. And he was noted as a leading member of the Pan-Africanist Congress, as the leader, in charge of publicity and information. The New York Times. I also want to note that Ndade John Pokela's tour of the United States in 1983 was widely documented. It was a media event. So I think that, again, this narrative that some movements were more marginalized and more peripheralized is really an invention of the post-1994 settlement. It is fair to say that across the SADC region, that there was the appetite and the respect that was held for all liberation movements was extremely high. It was well understood by most African countries, and especially across SADC, that the Pan-Africanist Congress was the first movement to actually have armed struggles, to form or later the Azanian People's Liberation Army, 18 months or almost 2 years before MK Mkhonto Wesizwe was formed, on the inspiration of APLA, I would say. Also fair to say that in this regard, that the longevity of, for example, prisoners, as well as Comrade Mantula said that the youngest prisoner ever was a then 14, 15-year-old Lebohang Moseneke, but that the first prisoners and the longest serving prisoners on that island were PAC cadres as well, including the late great, we used to call the blood tiger, Jafta Masemola, whose name needs to be known by many people. These names were known and understood by many of our colleagues across Zimbabwe, across Zambia, across Eswatini, across Lesotho and Botswana, which is why it was relatively simple for many members across political movements to find a home in those places, because there was political resonance, there was liberation resonance, but there was also the undertaking, by the way, that many countries had, especially Mozambique and Zimbabwe, that they wouldn't negotiate their independence until there was some flicker, some candle of hope, of a possibility of South African liberation coming into fruition. And that was a very bold stand at the time. So that countries like Zimbabwe delayed what could have been their own earlier liberation. And I think even though sometimes history, our story, can be complicated, and people also can become complicated figures, like in Tate Mugabe, I think it's also useful to state the good and the courageous stands that they took at the time. And lastly, to note, of course, the role that Kenneth Kaunda played, both on a personal but on a political level, and that his support was for all political movements as well. And that indeed there were many contradictions, and indeed there were many strange contestations. And it is our work in this moment to begin to unravel that as the SADC, as a SADC bloc, because it is a shared history, but that South Africa's own heritage, as I say, a vandalized heritage and memorial sector can then begin, hopefully be reinvigorated into some more honest truth-telling as well.
Yeah, Pheko, in conclusion, briefly though, after this process is done and dusted, after the ceremony with the president on Friday at Freedom Park, what is it that the country should be grappling with going forward? What should be on the agenda that speaks to the national question?
Yeah, so I think we've gone through the idea of what a reparational curriculum looks like, what a reparational ethic looks like. So that includes corporate accountabilities. It also includes grappling with some of the unspoken or the incomplete undertakings that were made by the TRC around memorialization. And some of those undertakings, by the way, include practical issues such as land restitution, which, by the way, is mentioned 100 times in many of the RDP documentations. It's mentioned 100 and yet it hardly features in the final TRC report. So that, I think, is something for us to grapple with. Questions of land and education for the survivors of people who were killed, who were assassinated, who were taken away in the prime of their lives. What becomes of their survivors? And that is over and above what the state should be doing for every South African, but certainly that there should be certain special care taken so that there's an intergenerational legacy, as to your point earlier, that communities and families that have been destituted by the loss of their loved ones, some who have never been found again. There's still a certain Ausnoktula Simelani, never been seen since, and her family have waited. I know her parents died waiting as well. And there are only a few very spectacular, like the Timor, that due to family resilience, and I think the role of family was mentioned, have been foregrounded. But I think it's unfair to expect individual families, some of them from very difficult personal and financial circumstances, who don't have access to lawyers, to the legal know-how, to how to work the system. It is unfair to expect that to rely on personal resilience. So I think that these are the things we should look at going forward. And of course, curriculum transformation, radical history and political science transformation.
Thank you so much, Lebohang Pheko, the Senior Research Fellow and political economist at the Trade Collective. Really appreciate your time. Advocate Mantula, in conclusion, your take on what happens after Friday, or what should happen after Friday?
For me, Aldrin, I'll say I share the same sentiments when he talks about curriculum. But I think on Friday it will be the opening of a long journey that we have to undertake. The NPA task, missing task team, they spoke about many numbers of people who have to be exhumed, and I think we need to emphasize on knowledge transfer, because forensic to do all this DNA, as I've said earlier, in terms of exhumation laws and the Health Tissue Act, you need to capacitate young people in this country to understand these processes. And like I said, the issue of reparation needs to be taken forward. Opening the can of worms, it is that how do you, when you say it's a closure, but it's an opening of the new chapter of that families, at least they know their loved ones through their bones being brought back. And I think the media should be consistent in holding government accountable on the monies that are going to be spent. And I want to correct myself again. I said the policy was drafted 2020, 2021. It's actually 2017.
Yes.
So on your poll question, it raises the issue that it has been too long.
Yeah. Why now?
Why now? You know, so I will assume that the issue of social cohesion, nation building should also be the catalyst. How do we bring the TRC processes forward in this country? But how do we teach the young people about these 49 remains that we are bringing consistently, that they know them from all liberation movements, from arts and culture space, because these were ordinary freedom fighters, but they were coming from different families, backgrounds. So it is important. Let us teach the young people about who were those people, Tot Machikisa, Duma Nokwe, Jonia Tipokela, Mabe, and many more, Aaron Tiros. So for me, like I said, we also have to unmask the law of exhumation in this country. The law students who are watching, they must know that we need to go and unmask this exhumation law of 1980, come up with a better law that will address these issues of historical and political and cultural in nature.
Advocate Mantula, thank you so much for your time. Advocate Mantula is a researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School on Public and International Affairs. Really appreciate your time.